Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural episode of the Saving UX podcast. Now, I believe that UX is in trouble, that we're not having the impact that we could. Now, this isn't about saving my job or my career that I've invested a quarter of a century in. It's really about having the biggest positive effect on the organizations and the real people that we serve. I'm your host, Jeremy Kriegel, and with me today, I have the great pleasure to introduce Nick Finck. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me as a guest here. It's been great to be on the show.
Well, Nick, I know you're all over the place, and a lot of people probably already know who you are. But would you mind maybe giving a quick arc of your career, just for folks who aren't familiar, just so they get a sense of your perspective and where you're coming from?
Yeah, the high level summary, because so I've been in the industry for about 25 years now. This March. And I've been in leadership and design management roles for the last 14 years. Kind of done a little bit of everything. Started as a developer, actually, and worked my way into design, and basically have done freelancing, started my own agency, ran that for a few years. I've been through 2 acquisitions. I've hyper-grown teams inside of enterprise corporations. Most recently, heading up design and research for AWS, and then heading up the platform team in Seattle for Facebook.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned being a coder because 25 years ago there weren't really the academic programs to be able to get into UX. So a lot of people started with being in something different. So I want to make sure we talk about growing and entering UX as a field. But before we get to that, how would you describe the state of UX now compared to at other points in history?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, UX is relatively new as far as a term, and it's often misunderstood. So there's kind of a big spaghetti mess around that, and I can kind of dive into that too. But I think the best way I can frame this is there's a lot of confusion in the industry. The genesis for the idea of UX was to essentially help businesses be successful, retain customers, and build essentially customers into loyalists and advocates for the business by providing better experiences. And those better experiences are things that help people complete tasks and get things done and accomplish stuff. And that was the genesis of it. And those in the profession at the time weren't always called UX designers, but as a businesses started to realize the value of this UX thing, even though they didn't quite fully understand what it was, they started hiring folks. And the unfortunate model of that was to hire folks into positions of a designer inside of an existing kind of framework and sort of operate in a process that the company already had. Rather than looking at UX as a net new field, a new area where design can be explored, and something that's more attached to solving user problems and marrying that with the key objectives of the business, so they're able to accomplish that. So that was kind of one of the biggest challenges, and I think in the current state of things, we're sort of at this point where companies are no longer calling them UX designers. They're using terms like product designer, and it's sort of a way for them to say, hey, we want this UX thing, but we really just want designers to produce. We want designers to create products and ship them, which, again, good for the business, not so good for the users, not so good for the customers. The missing gap there is really understanding what the problems are in the existing products, and really understanding the need for a product in the areas where a company might explore a new product being created. And that is kind of put by the wayside in the sake of producing design fast, and seeing if it sticks, so to speak. And I think, this has caused a lot of frustration. It's caused a lot of burnout, a lot of turnover. I do a lot of mentoring and coaching. And one of the most common topics I get is essentially around burnout, where a designer is asked to just quickly produce and just, one project after the next, rather than really thinking through what it is they're trying to accomplish as a company, as a business, that can help these users or customers, and provide a service that is valuable to them. And that time and thinking is kind of sort of backburnered for the sake of production. So that's kind of...
I always find that really, really strange. I mean, because I don't think you'd find anyone in an organization that says, I don't want to do something that serves my customer and I want them to have a terrible experience.
Yeah.
Right? The way you articulated UX, which I totally agree with, seems like it would align really well with just about what any stakeholder would say is important to them. So why don't we see it? I mean, we have UX process, we know how to get it done. Where's the disconnect?
Yeah. So, a lot is determined by like how teams are goaled and what is incentivizing teams, employees, product owners, leadership to do certain things. And those things are sometimes, and like, for example, in the case of engineering teams, it might be, how many features did you ship this quarter? Which, like, in my mind is kind of not a far leap from how many lines of code did you deliver? And I'm sure any reasonable engineer listening to this is going, my God, lines of code, we want this thing to be lightweight. We don't want to have a big bulky tool that's going to like be slow and, just underperform essentially. So when we measure things by features, you end up with products with a lot of features, right? And when you measure like leadership success, like VP or head of product or somebody in charge of essentially the product owner in a specific space, and you say your success is going to be measured upon getting this thing out the door. Well, I'm reminded of a scene in an old movie called Gun Ho, where they're asked to produce a certain number of automobiles in a automobile factory in the U.S. It was like the first, I think it was a Japanese automobile manufacturer, and they were trying to experiment to see if they could do this in the U.S. And what this particular scene I'm thinking of is they were trying to hit a number, and now the executive is coming to visit to say, did you hit the number? Basically, did you make your goal? And I think it's like Michael Keaton maybe was the main guy, and he was like taking a washcloth and rubbing it across where there should have been a window, but they hadn't finished that automobile. So there was no actual window there. And he was pretending like a window was there. And it's like even, scrubbing away at a little spot, and the whole thing is just clearly just a facade of a vehicle that wasn't finished because they're trying to hit their goal. That's not a good automobile for a consumer to buy, right? And that's the problem is we're not spending enough time thinking through what the actual, problems are, because what we're really seeing is symptoms, and we're trying to address the symptoms, saying like, oh, people are abandoning shopping carts, or people aren't upgrading their service. So we're going to like redesign these pages or add these features or whatever it is to try to smooth that out so that they do that. And then they find out, no, they're still not doing it. It's because there's a deeper rooted problem. Sometimes it's the product's overpriced. Sometimes it's not actually it's not scratching the itch that the actual customer has, or it's scratching the itch and it's also looking for 100 other itches to scratch. And it's just not an effective way, in other words, a product of 1,000 features that nobody wants to use. So it's like you're paying for that extra bloat that isn't really just helping you do your job.
Dude, I had the same experience. There was a startup I was with, and they figured out, so they had an acquisition goal. They made a promise to the board about a certain acquisition goal, a certain membership number they'd hit. And they figured out how big of an Amazon gift card they had to give away to get people to sign up. And it was a very specific audience that they were going for, and being intentionally vague. And so they could advertise to that audience that they could sign up and they get a gift card. And I had a neighbor who was a Target, and they told me, oh, this is great. I signed up. My husband signed up. We got our gift card. This is great. I said, did you use the service after that? Nope. And the metrics bore that out. The activity in the platform didn't change, even though that vanity metric of total number of accounts was going way up. So you're spending all this money, but not getting any value for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could look at even like the situation with Wells Fargo and, signing up accounts for people that are not even alive, to hit goals and metrics. So I think that's part of the problem. Sometimes the metrics are just wrong, like the company's using NPS, and it's sort of, the blind leading the blind at that point. But there's a number of bad metrics you could use. There's a number of bad goals you could set. But ultimately, what hasn't happened is essentially organizational maturity of how it thinks about design and how it believes design should operate. Right now, design in some organizations reports up through engineering managers. In other organizations, it might filter upward, like the leadership reports into the marketing team. In other cases, it might report up into product. And, sometimes, product might make sense because it's like, hey, they're product designers, they should report up to product. Unfortunately, the product, chief product officer is thinking about the product, the business, how they could get customers into the product, how can they make the product more effective, all the right things in a lot of ways. But what they're not thinking about is who actually are the customers, what are their needs, and not only just who are the customers and what are their needs, who are the users and what do they want to accomplish. So there's a distinction between a customer, who's the one paying for the product, and the user, who's the one who actually has to use the product. Right. And I think that disconnect happens at a number of different levels. They're also not generally thinking they are the most senior person in charge of design. They usually think they are the most senior person in charge of product. And so this gets into the where should design report up into, and you can have 1,000 different opinions on this. My opinion is that there should be a chief design officer. There should be an organizational structure that supports design from the top down, because design isn't actually limited to product. And when we talk about UX and the user experience, the experience doesn't end at the edges of the screen, right? It goes into the physical environment. It goes into the context at which somebody is using a physical device. And it goes into the context of like the lighting, the atmosphere, the audio, just everything going on around them, right? When we design interfaces, if we look at it from just you just design on screen standpoint, we fail to recognize that, yes, you're designing this system that's, customers are going to be able to, do this thing at the store, but you're failing to recognize that they're at a physical store. They need to access this screen. It's not from their personal device. It's going to be from a kiosk. Where is the kiosk placed? How is it positioned? What's the lighting look like? If people queued up to this machine, what would that look like? How does that be, is accommodated in a traditional brick and mortar store? All these factors come into play that is essentially part of the user experience, because it is the experience the person's going to have with this system and this product.
So let me ask you, when it comes to that structure, right, you talked about, where UX reports into, is it essential that there's a UX person at that, VP or C level, or is it important that that frame or that type of conversation is happening at that level, and having someone with that background is one way to ensure that it's happened? But if the head of product has that customer-centered focus, is that enough, or are we still missing something by not having someone directly leading UX involved at that level?
Yeah, so I think there's a combination of things there that it really comes down to the pedigree of the person in that role. If they have never been in a design role, and especially if they have never led a design team before, as much as their good intent is to be design-minded and think about this and know that it's important and have read up and are well-read on the topic, they are still not as versed as a person that has had that kind of pedigree. And I think that's a big part of the problem. Is I see in a lot of organizations, big and small, people get appointed to roles that essentially oversee the design team that have not had design experience. And I'm all for somebody expanding their knowledge into a space. Chief product officers are not expected to be designers, right? The problem is they're not necessarily thinking about it 24/7 from the right lens of design, users, and user needs. And that causes a disconnect in some of the decisions they make. I'll use the quote of that I heard once, and it's really kind of morbid, but there's something like the path to hell is paved by the bones and skulls of good intent, something to that effect. So this concept of, I'm sure they want to do well. Nobody's going to say we don't want design to succeed, but is it really ingrained in their bones? Is it really something that they take very seriously? And if they are not sure, or they believe they are, I challenge them to consider doing an evaluation of design maturity inside the organization. So that means all executive C-levels and VPs and up basically fill out a survey that's based on this scale called design maturity scale, and then have the design team do it. And then maybe have the engineers do it, and then maybe have the PMs do it, and kind of see where you net out. And inevitably, what you're going to find is executive leadership feels like they have a very solid design maturity, and it's like higher up on the scale. And most organizational departments will kind of fall in alignment with that. And then the design team is like, no, we're like 6 generations behind where we should be, kind of thing. Just we're so far in the dust that we don't even have these tools, these people in place. We don't have a design system. We don't have proper design leadership. We aren't being taken seriously. We're just sort of treated in this ancillary mode of, well, once the ideas are thought about what we want to create, then we bring in the designers, and the designers get frustrated with that because it's not necessarily ideas that are solving problems for customers and balancing that with the user or the business objectives.
And I think that goes back to some of what you were saying about the understanding of the value of UX and design. And it's hard to convince someone to solve a problem they don't think they have. Mm-hmm. Do you have an example, like a story of where you encountered that and how you helped them see like how much more UX could help them accomplish and how you were able to win them over? Yeah.
So when I worked at AWS heading up design and research, I worked with a number of different individuals, Scott Wiltmuth, Andy Jassy, and other folks. And Andy Jassy had a charter about, he kind of recognized that there was a problem with the design. There were essentially, in fact, there were 4 generations of design executed across something like 72 services that were launched at the time. What he identified was design inconsistency. And I believe that's just because 1, it's pixels. 2, you could physically see it. You could just look at it on a screen. And 3, it seemed like this is probably a simple problem that designers could solve. What happened was I basically spent the next year to year and a half walking the leadership team from this notion that it's just design consistency to this notion that there's deeper problems rooted in the offerings and how we present the offerings, the sort of behavior and flows within each product and service, and how inconsistent just the architecture was across products and services. And so it wasn't just at the surface UI level, it was stuff that was deeper into it. For example, not only did we have 4 generations of different designs that were dramatically different, as much as you could say, looking at a site that's created by Bootstrap versus a site that was created to look like Windows XP. That's how dramatically different those designs were. But under the hood, each team was creating services under different on different languages, coding platforms and languages, and they didn't have interoperability. They didn't really share stuff easily between these different languages and services without some level of interpreters, and that sort of stuff. So there was all this compounded issue of code under the hood. On top of all that, the users are trying to navigate these products, these services. If you've used AWS, it does like storage, compute, identity and access management, other things like that. chances are when you're creating something and you're going to use AWS as sort of the building blocks for this new product you're going to create, you're probably going to use a handful of services. You're going to use identity and access management. You're also going to use storage. You're going to use certain types of storage or multiple types of storage. You're going to use compute power. You might have an array of different types and levels of compute power. You're going to use machine learning and IoT services. So you're basically going in to what AWS looked like, all separate products. And they all function differently. So when you wanted to add something, the add button was in a different place. When you want to see a status report of the, security measures and patches that need to be executed or whatever it is, or whether there's like systems and services that are down or running or slow performing, you had to look in a whole bunch of different places. And every time you looked at a different place, it was like the same information might be portrayed in very different ways, and sometimes cause misunderstanding of what is actually happening. So like the alert for something severe in one system shows as just kind of a minor thing in another system. Because in that other system, it's not core to what, that other service is focused on. It's just that kind of compounded issue, as well as just how people go through creating objects, saving objects, editing, all the cruft sort of stuff. Of being able to manipulate, save, replicate, and then tutorials and walkthroughs and guidance, in products. So this took walking leadership from this notion of lipstick on a pig, to be frank, to we need a different pig, and we have to really actually need a series of things. And this kind of led to us building one process, more effective processes and defined processes for the design team and organization. Also review boards and things like that frankly are seen as gatekeepers of design, but frankly help provide better guidance for teams to deliver more effective products that are well-designed, consistent, operate the same way. Users can go from one service to another and expect pretty much the same thing. Like they know where to spin up stuff and shut down things. They know how to get into their sort of permission settings for stuff. They know how to close and shut down an entire service if they need to. And it's always uniform in the surface level, but also in the architectural level, because we're using code components, because we've created a design ops team and a DevOps team that work hand in hand to roll out components, so that when a developer needs to create something, instead of reinventing the wheel and getting the wheel somewhat right and somewhat consistent, but not quite enough, they actually could just grab components, and those components would be by de facto consistent. And then when we needed to update those components, we could universally roll it out because it's centralized code. But it requires the design team to be much broader than just this sort of isolated tertiary service that delivers UI.
Now, right? I'm guessing, like, you're laying out this great roadmap of things that you put in place to make sure that you got to a more positive outcome. Mm-hmm. But I'm guessing when you first started bringing this up, the response wasn't, "Oh my God, Nick, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. How much money do you need? And here's all the people and resources you want. Go fix the problem." I'm guessing it wasn't that easy.
That's not that far off.
Okay,
when I started,
great.
it was a team of 6 or 7. Andy Jassy smelled smoke, so he threw money at it. He basically headcount. My headcount ask was somewhere around 100. I think I got a headcount total of about 33. I hired most of those folks within 3 months. So you can imagine the mass amount of interviewing like crazy.
So the lesson there is ask for 3 times as many people as you need?
What's that?
Ask for 3 times as many people as you need?
Well, I mean, I didn't expect them to kind of say no to the 100 ask. But at the same time, they were coming at it from the standpoint of nobody ever in the history of Amazon has ever even hired a third of those people within 3 months. And I did. It's just they thought they're going to give headcount and we wouldn't be able to hire it, and we'd be kind of holding on to it because we're trying to hire for it. And therefore, we kind of sort of secure a budget that isn't, can't be dismantled until at least the half-year mark, where the engineer teams that need engineers and don't get the headcount need that headcount, right? So they thought we'd be kind of hoarding headcount, essentially, or hoarding budget in one ways, because we wouldn't be able to hire for it. And the funny thing is even after we hired that team, that organization of 33, we still only had like one designer spread across like 4 products. We only just started getting to the area where we had more than one designer in a given sort of vertical. So like storage, for example, we had 2 designers in it, and compute power, we had, I think it was at least 2 designers in that, but a lot of these service areas, like identity and access management and reporting and alerts and all that kind of stuff, like one designer spread across like a whole bunch of tiny little, services, but very important services, right? So we didn't quite even get the coverage we need. And the interesting part is when you graph it out, when you graph actually the growth and the headcount, again, this is like hiring 33 people in 3 months, right? I mean, essentially, it was not quite 33 because we had, obviously the core team that was there of 6, but a lot of hyper growth. And when you looked at the products, when I started at that time, when I was asking for that headcount, we had supported around like 72 to 75 odd services. Not all those were launched. I think there was like 50 launched, and the rest were being worked on at that time, scheduled to go out at that year's reInvent. So when I left, the organization was of 33, but the number of services was 150. So if you graph that out, we're not catching up. We're actually falling farther and further behind, right? And it's not so much like throw, the whole adage of throw more headcount at it and then we'll solve the problem faster or whatever. It's just more that these are complicated systems. These are very technical systems with, frankly, a whole crap ton of acronyms and terminology used in technology-based terminology that designers that might not be familiar with IT infrastructure have to learn and understand how all these things play together and what they mean to get ramped up. The average ramp-up time for a designer, even a senior designer on the team being hired, was about a year before they could be in a meeting where they could, when an idea was being floated about something that was going to affect the user experience, that they feel confident enough about their understanding of the product space to say, hey, actually, that's a great idea. We could take that approach. Here's another idea I'm thinking about is here's how I might approach that problem and how I might try to go about solving it, without necessarily talking about like how to design a screen, but more just like being able to have enough understanding of that space to be able to speak up in a meeting where it's all like the VPs in the room, the GMs in the room, and all that kind of stuff, right? So
that's a pretty complex domain.
Yeah.
So,
these are complicated systems, right? So this whole notion of hire somebody and they'll hit the ground running is just a complete myth. So anybody's going to need ramp up, even on not so complicated systems. My goal was to try to get that ramp from a year ramp to somewhere closer to at least 6 months if we could. And we were able to do that by defining processes, by having design systems, we actually created our own dictionary of terms, all sorts of stuff that were basically different tools that can help somebody ramp up fast. We created an onboarding program. So Amazon had its global onboarding for any employee it hires, which is a great program. And then there is some kind of notion of onboarding for designers, but not too much because it really depended on what division and department and team you were in. So we've created onboarding for AWS, right? Here's what you're going to need to know coming into this. Here's what you're going to need to know that we've like established as common practices within AWS, just in terms of like, what these things mean, how these organizations, just even like the org chart, like there's a phone tool you can learn about who's your boss and everything, but it doesn't always say like where products sit in underneath this org. So building out something that communicates all that kind of stuff.
I really want to dig into this one thing because it's going through my mind that one is, I think in order for you to have gotten that permission to hire that many people, clearly you were able to connect the value of what you were going to do and what UX was going to bring to what was important to that business, or you never would have gotten your 33 headcount in the beginning.
Yeah.
And yet again, like you said, it's not about throwing heads at the problem, and yet the number of services, and I'm guessing the number of engineers, was far outstripping the growth of design. And I'm guessing engineering probably had a similar challenge in terms of ramp up on a complex system. Mm-hmm. But I imagine there were probably more of them that could help each other get up to speed faster. So again, like what, maybe in hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently or you would have helped UX keep pace with that growth?
Yeah, I mean, you could set targets like, for how many ever engineers you'll have one designer sort of thing. In AWS, my experience was that there was one designer for about every, I want to say it was like something like 75 engineers, just depended on what, the product was. Wow. And it just, they, at that point you're just triaging. You're not even designing. You're basically you're getting so many requests and you just need to get, like the team just needs you as a designer spread across all that 70 something odd engineers to just eyeball things, see if it's like way off or could work. And this is what the situation was, is they were just sort of like triaging, eyeballing things, sort of giving cursory like feedback just in person with PMs that were using Balsamiq to design everything. Right. And there's nothing wrong with Balsamiq. I'm just saying, like, it's a tool that somebody like a PM could get into real quick and, sort of whiteboard out, so to speak, a design interface, and the designer could get rapid feedback to them. But the designer spent all this time triaging all this stuff and focusing on they had to support, these N number of products, but then also EC2 was launching something that was like really important for reInvent. So like, obviously the priority is going to be spent there, and that's where they're actually going to be working on. And even though they're assigned to all this other stuff, and some things just got no love, and some things got a little love, and then some things got a lot of love, right? We changed that model by growing so that it wasn't triage, that the designers could actually work on the products. Even if they were stretched thin between like 4 major products or something like that. And then we built processes in place. So one for support for the designer, like critique sessions, stand-up meetings, had a manager that was overseeing things that were by sort of vertical. And then also methods that were basically allowing teams that didn't have designers assigned to them, because there were. We worked with Andy Jassy, Scott Wiltmuth, Ken Exner, and all these other folks to figure out what were the priority things, what were the big fish that we need to make sure we covered. And the things that fell outside of that didn't get designer support. What they got was design office hours, and those actual sessions were really great because we brought in like 5 or 6 people from the design team for a given hour and worked very closely with those teams to get them pretty far along, and answer a lot of their questions. So that was kind of like a sort of coverage sort of thing. And there were other complications in terms of the things that like you hear from designers occasionally, like on Twitter and other things, where it's like, hey, I'm working on this product, and that product. 4 different products, and they are all very different. They operate in completely different space. And at one moment, I'm designing on product A. Somebody comes up and wants to talk to me about product B. I now have to switch gears, think about the context, think about what the product is, who their audience is. It might be a different audience. The context switching isn't really considered. So one of the other things we did is make sure that basically our designers, especially the ones that were paired, were basically grouped in such a way that you could almost look at it as like the GM had X number of designers under them, rather than where it was before, where a designer might be, well, this GM has 1.5 designers and the other 0.5 is actually spread across this other GM in another organization and this one product in your organization, at being a GM, just kind of split that up where it made logical sense. And I'm not saying like you should organize your design teams based on executive leadership. I think it was, I don't know if it's Cheryl Platts or somebody had like a model around this called organizational underwear. It's like your organizational underwear showing you're organizing something like, and it was more in terms of UI and architecture. You organize your navigation based on the organizational structure of the company. Instead, more just that in order for life to be simple as a designer, you need to kind of be operating on products in the same general proximity. And that usually meant those things are grouped under a specific GM and a specific VP or SVP, et cetera. And that helped with that context switching. And then we also did things where we had floating designers that would kind of cover, especially when things were like not really accounted for in our headcount and sort of alignment model. And instead was stuff that just sprung up overnight. GM over here leaves. Now this product team inherits this product that's been there, but they didn't inherit the headcount for the designer. So then you have this floating designer that could kind of like sort of jump on it to kind of put out a fire, so to speak.
I love how you emphasize the prioritization. That some things that are important get full support, and everything else you got to say no to, except you find some way to help them out a little bit, whether it's that floating designer, the UX office hours. I always think that's brilliant. I always found that in some ways that helps communicate the value of design to those other teams, which often then comes back at you, because then those teams will advocate for more budget so they can get that higher level of support. So I always think it's great to be able to carve out that time to support, your lower priority teams in some way.
Yeah, and that's
I wanted
exactly
to ask you about I want to ask you about the growth in terms of the type of people that you brought on, in terms of, thinking about senior people. I mean, I often think when there's not a lot of time, you tend to want more senior people because, they can execute, but then you can't just have a team of all senior people. So how did you, think about that mix of team versus, junior versus senior versus manager, and you talked about some of the critiques as a way to help educate people, not just in the domain, but also help them grow as practitioners. But maybe talk a little about team structure and how you help bring people up through the ranks.
Yeah, I mean, our team, we were kind of lucky that our team had a pretty, not the best, but had some level of range in terms of skill and leveling of designers. So we had interns, we had contractors that were kind of more on the junior side. We had, I wouldn't say we had necessarily, I guess we did have a few junior level folks. And then the bulk of the team was mid and senior level, with like a few one principal level, one kind of going principal to principal level. That helped quite a bit. I think one of the sort of myths is this like notion of, when we have a lot of work that needs to be done, we need somebody to execute it well, so we need to have senior. What they fail to recognize is when you look at the work itself, you have things that are more complicated beasts that involve like a certain level of experience to handle, and you have really basic rudimentary tasks. I'm going to use, and maybe this would be a horrible analogy, but I'm going to use an analogy I use for time management. It's the same kind of thing. You have boulders, and it might require somebody who has some strength to move, right? And you have sand, okay? And the sand could be easily lifted by pretty much anybody who has a little bit of understanding of this, right? And then there's pebbles and there's rocks in between, right? And if you hire all senior level people, they're going to want to just push boulders. And when they look at the sand, they see it as a distraction. It's like they have to move the sand, but I really want to be working on the boulder. Okay. And when it's only senior level people, they are the ones that are doing it all. They are moving boulders. They are moving rocks. They are moving pebbles. They are moving sand. That sand could impact them like in a major way. In other words, the junior level tasks, they could spend an entire day doing what I would call junior level tasks instead of thinking about the bigger picture, bigger problems that the company's trying to do that will really set the company ahead. And they have the experience to be able to work on those bigger problems, but instead we're having them doing a bunch of junior tasks because we don't have junior designers to do those tasks, right? So there's that compounded problem, right? This is why when you build a team, you need to start thinking about it, not just hiring all seniors. You need to think about it, hiring juniors to kind of do that kind of stuff and hiring seniors to do the bigger picture stuff. But like, how many seniors do you really need and how long are they going to be entertained for at your company? If you have an army of 30 seniors, at some point, there's going to be somebody who doesn't have a boulder to push, and they're going to find their way out because they're tired of dealing with rocks. They want a boulder, and they're also asked to do the sand job, right? So they are going to find their way out. They're going to find their way into an organization where they're doing something more impactful. You always hear designers want impact. They want to, that's what they value in their career, is to have some impact on something. And that's really what it comes down to. So I think we tend to overhire senior level and underhire junior level. And there's a number of other complications with just the whole thing of, well, like this perception that hiring a junior level person means we have to hold their hand quite a bit and just, like walk them through every little thing. And like, it's like the pre-prep kitchen where every ingredient is separated out into the right measurement into a little, container, and all they have to do is sort of dump it together. And that's kind of how we think of junior designers. And the reality is some of these junior designers are brilliant people, and they just haven't had the opportunity to work on something amazing. And everybody along their career path so far maybe has just kind of said, here's the instructions and here's the ingredients already separated out, and we're just going to kind of like hold your hand through this. And it's frustrating to them, right? They want to be able to show that they can perform, right? And I've seen this because, I created an internship program at a company called Ubermind that was eventually bought by Deloitte Digital. But we created this internship program, and our intern quickly moved into being a junior level designer and quickly moved into being a mid-level. Basically today, I think he heads up an entire design organization, and it hasn't been that many years. This person was running circles around my senior designers, and he was the title of a junior designer. So you can find talent. They have to have the growth mindset, like they don't know it all, right? And they have to have a passion for the role and the work they're doing. And they have to basically be a resilient person to that when they fail, that they could get back up and keep going. In order to do that, as a leader of that design team, you have to provide a safe space for them to fail. You have to basically provide shielding from when they fall flat on their face, that the company isn't trying to just fire them, right? You have to protect them from that. It's a learning opportunity. They get back up, they learn something about this, what not to do, and then they move forward with that knowledge, right? So we have to provide a safe space for folks to fail. In addition, the growth mindset. I tend to only hire people that have that. I didn't know what it was called when I was first hiring my first designers. I think me and Jesse Hurlitz called it the hunger, this sort of attitude of, I don't know it all, I'm going to learn, and I'm going to keep learning. Even when I'm doing the work and further along in my career, I'm going to keep learning. Look, I've been in the industry for 25 years, and I'm learning something new every day. So everybody else on the team, senior designers all the way through junior, should always be learning. If they don't have that, if they come into the interview like they already know everything, that's a big red flag. That's somebody that you won't really be able to train. They're going to be dogmatic about their ways of doing things, and their ways of doing things could get dated pretty fast, right? So you need to be able to make sure that everybody on the team has a growth mindset. And there needs to be a shared understanding of expectations and what the team values. So as a leader in the design organization is creating the design team's values, which are sometimes different than the company values, right? And establishing what's important to the design team, what we expect, what we believe in as a design team. And that should be done collaboratively with the design team, not just by the manager, and sort of dictated top down from the design leadership. So those are things that need to be put in place for that. At AWS, those designers coming on board and looking at a 1-year ramp up, the first thing we did, we built an onboarding system. We also built a buddy system, right? So they had a senior designer they were paired up with that would help them grow. That senior designer may or may not be in their product space. Ideally, they're in the same product space because they have, that extra context helps, right? But if they're not, they need to be somebody who can switch to the context of the space the junior designer is operating in and be able to give them proper support, knowing, how that space sort of works. So sometimes it's a senior designer who may have previously worked in, let's say the junior designer is hired in storage. They previously worked in storage, but now are in compute or something like that. They can provide that support. So everybody had a buddy. And that's a person they could go to. And that's the thing I'm learning as I go and coach and mentor people is the number of people that come to me seeking advice that haven't bothered to talk to their manager or are afraid to talk to the manager, or the question they have for the manager, they feel like it's going to put them in a position where they should know something they don't know. Okay. Yeah. I always say there's no stupid questions. The only stupid question is the question that doesn't get asked. Okay. So having a buddy is another person they could go to that's not the manager, that isn't in charge of their review, that can hear their questions no matter how silly they are, and be able to help them find those answers or give them guidance or point them in the right direction to find those answers. I think that's
a really important thing to call out, because as managers, if the people who we're responsible for aren't asking us those stupid questions on a regular basis, that should mean that we're not creating the safe space for them to come to us with what they're really struggling with. And that's on us.
Well, it is. When it's a new hire, though, they're still got to remember, like, they're going to spend the first possibly even up to 6 months, not just ramping up on their product space, but just kind of getting a sense for the culture at the company, getting a sense for the culture on the design team, getting a sense for how their design manager operates, and, you know, what would be a good or bad thing to do in terms of asking questions, and how they should even operate in a one-on-one with their manager. Some people go into these situations where they get hired by these companies and like, okay, here's your one-on-one, and the designer's just expected to know what that should entail and what they should prepare for. You know, so a good manager will set expectations very clearly and help try to get the designer to quickly understand the culture and that it is a safe space. And the best way to do that is by talking to somebody who's already been in the space and is in the space, and that's your buddy, right? So that buddy is like, you know, can I really go to this manager and ask him this? Sure. He would love those kinds of questions. You know, it's like, oh, I don't want to bother him. They look so busy and all this. It's like, no, go and bug them. This is important. You know, they're the person that can reassure them. They're a mentor, right? And I think that's one of the things that I always see is, like, people talk about, like, oh yeah, I have a mentor. And then, like, you ask them some questions, you find out it's really their boss. And, like, there's certain things you just may not be able to communicate to your boss, because it puts you, like, for example, I'm thinking about leaving. I would love every one of my reports to be able to have the confidence to come up to me to say that, so I could work with them and see if we could provide a space that was going to give them what they feel like is missing at the current in the current role.
Absolutely.
But a lot of times they won't. They just can't convince them to do that. So having somebody they could go to that's not their manager, that could be sort of an internal mentor, can do that. Also, there's some value in external mentors, because they're not your boss. They don't work at the company. There's no risk in that regard. And it's usually a safe space that information that you communicate to your external mentor is not going to be relayed to anybody inside the company. So therefore, you can be more open and honest to that person in a lot of ways, very quickly, without having to ramp up into that.
So that's a good pivot. I want to dive into that, because you have helped grow people from a number of different perspectives. You've been a manager, so you've had that official role. You've been an internal mentor. You've been an instructor at boot camps. You're now doing private mentorship and coaching. How do you see some of the different challenges of helping to grow people, to be better individual contributors and better collaborators, better UX folks?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with that first principle of a growth mindset, right? And this is, some of the good boot camps and educational programs, formal or otherwise, will kind of start off with the standpoint of, you make it what it is. So like, yeah, you could pay a lot of money to go through a boot camp, and if you're not committed to it, if you're not really absorbing the material because you're not completely invested in it, then it's going to show, and you're going to struggle to find your first job and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of like mentorship and growing others, they have to have a mindset where they know they can grow. They know they might have some deficiencies. And usually those kinds of engagements, especially like the formal coach kind of engagement, kind of starts out with, the person kind of saying, here's what I think are my gaps, and you could work on that with them. And over time, you kind of build this relationship, and eventually you start to uncover other gaps that might even be bigger gaps. And the stuff they thought were their gaps were just because imposter syndrome or, self-doubt, kind of things. Or just they haven't done it enough, and it's not that they're not good at it. They just simply haven't practiced it enough. Right. So having a good mentor and coach can help with that. So internally as a manager, when I'm trying to grow other designers, usually there's some things that I know I kind of come to the table with, like things that I feel like they might be able to grow in. And growth isn't necessarily like, gee, you're really horrible at this thing, you need to improve it. It could be, but it could also be, you know what, you're actually really good at this and you need to practice it more and get even better.
You could be great. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we see potential, like, for example, some people that I find in the design space, they have like a title like UX designer, product designer. And I start having conversations with them. I start learning about who they are and what their interest is. And, or even just on product teams when we're talking about a product in some particular area, and they start like getting like really passionate about something and talking a lot about it and giving a lot of ideas and have a lot of great things are contributing to the conversation. I start to recognize like, and like sometimes, for example, like they're a designer role, and anytime anything about information architecture comes up, they just start to you just see them really glow. Right. And you start to recognize like they have a lot of potential here, and they just haven't really practiced that enough to really be like a subject matter expert on information architecture, for example. And the company could really find value in that because maybe we're a search company or a large index or something, or things that are going to involve like deep architecture of controlled vocabularies and, multifaceted navigational systems or whatever it might be. Right. That said, like seeing that in somebody, it takes some time to get to know them to kind of see that come out, and then saying, hey, here's a growth opportunity for you. If you want to go down this path, we could do it. We can take you from good at this and passionate about it to really great at this, and here's how, and kind of walk them through that. But some folks they're completely unaware because they've never had anybody kind of go, you're pretty good at that thing.
Yeah. I noticed this. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we as managers need to be way better at like telling people when they're doing a good job. It's very easy to focus on the things that aren't going well and the fires that break out or the complications somebody brings to the table or whatever, and complain about that to them and tell them they need to fix all these things. But what we fail to do is also pat people on the back when they're successful, tell people when they are doing a good job, remind them of how good of a job they did on something, and not in a just gratuitous, I'm just going to do this because I need to do this kind of way, but like a genuine way. Right. And that could go a long ways, because you'd be surprised at how many people aren't told they're really good at something. I have many stories about that outside of design. But that leads people to leaving the field because they just don't know if they're really on the right track, and they haven't been told. And so therefore they think they're just kind of mediocre at it. And they kind of, well, maybe I'll go do this other thing. And then they just exit. Right. So I think that's important. The other thing I'll also say, and this is something we tend to do very poorly, is when we see an opportunity for somebody to grow, we need to make sure that they are provided with the opportunity to grow those skills. So for example, if I have somebody that's been working on this kind of like maintenance mode project for a long period of time, but I see that they have these qualities that come up and surface in conversations about how they would love to create a product that kind of bridges this other gap that they noticed. And they're really passionate about talking about it. And it's going to involve, a lot of certain aspects of UX. And maybe in their current state, in the current maintenance mode, they just don't do those kinds of things. So we need to make sure like we as managers basically build that for them. Like, okay, they're talking about this. Let's start pitching it upward. Let's see if we can build a new product in this space, and they can be somebody on that team, if not leading that, design effort there. Right. And, you have to be careful though, because there is also this notion of farmers and hunters, which is some people are just really good at maintaining and improving something that exists. And some people are really good about dealing with like the ambiguity of, go tackle some new product that we don't even know what it looks like, but we know it needs to exist in this general ballpark of a space. And we want you to go figure out where the boundaries of that ballpark are and then what that's going to look like. And it's just this like vague, super vague ask of very little direction. Some people thrive in that. You take somebody who thrives in that and throw them on a maintenance mode project or maintaining and improving and growing a project. They don't tend to do they don't tend to do too well. And you take somebody that is in the maintenance and growing, and throw them into this vague area. They tend to ask a lot of questions and feel out there like they're just like wandering aimlessly looking for what this could be, right? And so you have to kind of recognize where people fall in that kind of spectrum. But if it's aligned with how they kind of operate, you could put them in a situation where they are on a product team that allows them to have that growth and to be able to demonstrate it. That's where you start getting those reviews that are really great, because now they're in something they're passionate about. They've been given the permission to operate in that space. The manager even carved out a space for them. And now they're able to really just kind of strut their stuff to show, like the butterfly coming out of the cocoon and just really just show their brilliance, right? And you can't do that by just having them do the same mundane thing when you see those opportunities.
All right, Nick, I want to kind of try to bring this all together because we have talked on so many different topics. We've hit on how managers can support the people that we're in charge of. We've talked about prioritization. We've talked about selling up. We've talked about, teams supporting each other, and lots more that is not right at the tip of my tongue. If you were to say, here's the one thing that I think people really should focus on, maybe either at any level or maybe one thing for managers and one thing for ICs, what do you see as like a really important thing for people to either focus on or make sure they're doing to help grow the impact of UX in their organization?
Yeah. So one thing, and I'm going to borrow a note from Joe Natale here, who's used this example kind of repeatedly. Probably not the only person who has, but sometimes organizations don't know there's like opportunity to grow and improve and mature a design organization until they feel a bit of pain.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating for make it difficult for the organization. You'll probably find yourself quickly out of a job that way. But there needs to be some level of real pain for the organization before they really start investing in design. Everybody, again, has good intents. Nobody wants to be like, oh, we hate this design org, or we don't need designers, or we're going to, we're not really going to listen to them, or, like they genuinely want everybody to succeed. But we're kind of in this era where design is not quite reached its maturity stage inside of most organizations that it needs to be at to really be that thing that like UX was originally promised for, right? This idea of growing loyalists and advocates, better experiences for customers, better business, word of mouth marketing, seamless task completion by users, all these other things, right? We're not there. We're not there at all, right? And in order to get organizations to start valuing design on that level, we need to, one, be first off in the executive leadership level of design. And we need to be able to speak the business language. And in addition to that, we need to be able to talk about what design, can bring to the table for that organization. And it's different for every organization. There's no pattern or boilerplate I could give you that could say this to them. In fact, like when I think about like the analogy of what I did at AWS to get AWS to see the value, the broader picture of design, I would summarize it as, there's that old adage of the glass half full, the glass, half empty, and whatever, like the optimist, pessimist, etc. What I talked about was, AWS was market leader in cloud computing, and they have competitors that are quickly catching up in a lot of ways. And people will argue with us night and day, but I've been on the inside. You could argue with me all you want, but they are quickly catching up. And the challenge that I think they had, and the way essentially the wording and positioning that I had with it was around this notion that the glass is full and the water is seeping out over the edges. We need to build a bigger glass. And that means not just a robust solution offering and like more than 150 product or services. My God, how many services do we need? But more in terms of how do we build systems and processes internal that allow design to be baked in rather than bolted on. And that's the baked in, bolted on goes back to accessibility and how we also should think about accessibility. Thank you, Matt May. It's true though. Like there's a lot of organizations that just see design as this like thing inside of a product team. That's like one of, like some people will talk about the three-legged stool, the engineering, design, and product, or product management for that, more clarity. And that's fine. That's a product team and how it exists today. But really what we need to be thinking about design as not just even the people in the design team and how that design team is organized, but culturally part of how we do business, and that's a mental leap for a lot of folks, to kind of think about it from the standpoint of when we think about our offerings to our customers, what is the ramifications of this offering, like the whole like ethics and what's the worst it could do, what's the best it could do. And also think about it from the standpoint of how do we make people's lives easier, still achieve our business goals, and improve our business by gaining additional customers that we wouldn't have otherwise because of the advocacy of our customers.
I love that metaphor of... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say I love that metaphor of building a bigger glass. Yeah. But also that change of perspective of that, the glass, there's water in the glass, but it's leaking out. Yep. And because I've had a very similar experience where I think a lot of designers think about how do we make things better?
Yeah.
And a lot of stakeholders they tend to react to risk avoidance. Yep. And sometimes reframing what we do as risk avoidance, we're avoiding the bad thing by doing the good thing, sometimes I think can connect more viscerally than talking about how much more we'll connect with customers and how much better we'll make it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a number. I mean, every executive, and this is the whole like, a seat at the table, design needs a seat at the table and all that, it's like, yes, we don't have a seat at the table. Let's just be frank. We don't have a seat at the table. And we don't have a seat at the table because we are in this position where we're organizationally looked at as something connected to product and something connected to product teams. That's, for lack of a better word, the current state of things, right? To go back to the first question, right? The thing that we need to really look at is design is the market change, the net change we need to see in the market. And that's the next, sort of state of technology. Kind of going back to like the feature wars where everybody was like trying to, if you remember back in the old days, software is in a box and then there's a spine, and on the spine of the box, it had all the bullet points of all the features. And then version 2 had like more bullet points. And that was sort of like how marketing kind of said, you need to buy the new thing. And now we're long since moved away from obviously anything in a box, much less anything with a version number on it. But the idea of just throwing more things at it is not actually helping our customers. What we need to do is look at what are they trying to accomplish and how can we help them accomplish it? What are the things that are necessary for them to accomplish? And whatever else isn't, get the hell out. Get the hell out of their way. Tuck it back in the corners and recesses and the more buttons of our interfaces, and let them focus on just getting the damn thing done instead of overwhelming them with all this. Look at all these things we could do that our competitor doesn't. It's like, no, if you want me to buy your product, I want you to do one thing, and I want you to do that one thing damn well. And maybe there can be a few ancillary things that are connected with that one thing, but don't try to be my Swiss Army knife. I already have Swiss Army knives, and there are like 15 other products over there. And then there's this notion of, well, what if the Swiss Army knife, it's a collection of things? It's like, Yeah, and now we have AWS of 150 services. When you go in, you literally click and there's 150 icons, right? That's not servicing the customer well, right? That is not helping them find the opportunity to just do what they need to do, which is, I need to build a mobile app, store it somewhere, and have some stuff processed. Like that's what they're trying to do. They're not trying to figure out what is an elastic beanstalk versus a cloud formation. That doesn't help them, right? Those were some of the efforts we did there, is to try to kind of move that dial forward. But it takes that notion of, your customers are leaving, your potential customers, this water, this faucet that's coming into your company is literally flowing out the top of the cup because you're the market leader, and now they're going to the other competitors because you're not offering them a better experience. Instead, you're offering them just more things to do, right? That's not really effective.
Helping them, to your point, may not be helping them actually solve their problem.
Yep.
Or especially if they, even if the feature's there, if it's not designed in a effective way, still might be getting more in their way than really helping. Well, look, Nick, I know there's so much more we could talk about. Maybe we'll have to do a round 2 at some point. But for now, if people want to follow you and hear more from you, what are the best places they can find you?
Definitely find me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there. Connect with me. I tend to tweet about design a lot. I also have design lists under my profile for like design leaders and other things that are interesting to follow, that say a lot of great things about design and give you a lot of good ideas about how to frame and think about things. Other places to find me, you can find me on my personal site, nickfink.com. I have my mentoring and coaching services available there. If you're a business and you're looking for to essentially have somebody advise your business on how to grow your design organization, or looking for somebody to coach your design team collectively, Craft and Rigor would be the place to go, craftandrigor.com. And then outside of that, I also do a weekly chat with a few of my great friends, Joe Natali and Lisa Angela. And they are great folks in terms of like learning from. If you're wanting to learn about UX and have some interesting questions around UX and design, I would recommend joining us. I think it's every Thursday at 10:30 Pacific time. We tend to go pretty long, so feel free to join. And if you need to leave for your meeting, leave for your meeting. But we'll be there again next week, and it's all based on the questions that you ask. So that's another great place. And then there's a bunch of podcasts and stuff linked on my personal site. If you want to hear more from me, check that out. And this one, of course, will be linked there too once we go live. So you'll be able to find it there if you're trying to locate like this interview. But those would be places to contact me and reach out. Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm always there. I'm always happy to help however I can. If I don't have the answers, I'm always happy to point you to somebody who might, or a resource that could answer it for you.
And I've been a long-time follower of yours on Twitter, and I've been able to sit in on some of your Clubhouse sessions. A lot of great content there, so highly encourage people to follow. We will put all those links in the show notes, which you'll be able to find at sux.live. That's SUX for Saving UX, sux.live. Again, Nick, thank you so much for kicking off this awesome conversation. Look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's been great.